in the order that you put the questions in. Jenny will outline how Mao adopted Marxist ideology to drive the Chinese peasant revolution during the years 1925 to 1949. And this event is being held on an auspicious day in Chinese revolutionary history, the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the Communist Party of China. And it's at a time when China is central to and at the forefront of world affairs. The broadsheet press and The Economist magazine have been giving extensive coverage to the CPC anniversary. Today's FT is leading on the US and Japan, coordinating war games amid tensions over Taiwan. And at the recent G7 summit, US President Biden expressed the concerns of the capitalist world that they are unable to compete with China's tremendous Belt and Road Initiative. Jenny's lecture, of course, is historical rather than contemporary, and will examine Mao's theory and practice as the driving force of the Chinese Revolution, the relationship between the national and the agrarian revolution, as well as the relevant lessons for today. Jenny is a China specialist. She's the author of China's Global Strategy Towards a Multipolar World. She first visited as a young student in 1971 and has followed China's developments and international role closely since then. As a university lecturer, she taught courses on China and ran an undergraduate degree program in Asia Pacific Studies. Her academic research, based on fieldwork investigating the reform of township and village enterprises, led to notable publications. Today's topic is based on her PhD thesis, awarded in 1989 by the University of Manchester, on peasants and revolution in China, taking a Marxist perspective. This is now to be published later this year by Praxis Press. She is active in CND, Stop the War, is a vice president of the Society for Anglo-China Understanding, and a member of the No Cold War campaign globally and in Britain. I now invite Jenny to address the question, was Mao a Marxist?
Thank you very much for that introduction, Kevin.
Mr. Booker.
Is that okay? Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, please mute your systems, colleagues.
Oh.
Right, okay. So I just wasn't sure what was going on there. I think I was just muted then. Is everything okay now, Kevin?
You're okay, you're not muted.
Right. Yes, okay. So I'm going to take as my starting point Edgar Snow's famous book, Red Star Over China, which opens with a series of questions he was looking to answer as he set off for Yan'an in the mid-1930s. Was the Chinese Communist Party a genuine Marxist party or just a bunch of red bandits? Was the Red Army essentially a mob of hungry brigands, as the right-wing Kuomintang nationalists made out? From the left also, at this time, Mao was being accused of departing from proletarian politics. For Trotsky, the Chinese Communist Party under Mao's leadership had been captured by the peasants, and rich peasants at that. Today, similar skepticism is directed at whether or not China is genuinely socialist, referencing these doubts from the past about the earlier CPC history. Mao was indeed a peasant leader, and the Communist Party could not have come to power without the support of hundreds of millions of peasants. They joined its mass organizations, they joined the party itself, they carried out and conformed with its policies, and they gave material support in paying taxes and enlisting in its armies. Mao's strategy of protracted revolution, building red bases in the countryside to encircle the towns, is familiar to most people and will not be my focus here. To answer this question, was Mao a Marxist? It might be expected then that I start with his essays on philosophy, on practice, and on contradiction. But these essays in themselves will not be the focus of my discussion either. For Mao, Marx was a guide to action, a guide to making revolution. Marxism provided a viewpoint and a methodology. His essays issued in 1937, the one a theory of knowledge and the other an approach to analysing material reality in terms of social relations, were actually a call for Marxism to be grounded in the particularities of the Chinese situation, a call for the signification of Marxism, the application of Marxist tools of analysis to solve the concrete problems of China, developing Marxism with Chinese characteristics. And it's my purpose today, focusing on this main question of peasant organisation, to show how Marxism was applied, setting out the concrete circumstances within which these essays were issued and how they came about. With the Japanese armies preparing to move into China, Mao was already calling for a fundamental shift in the direction of CPC policy and revolutionary strategy in 1935, looking to renew a united front. His ideas developed by 1937 into building national resistance under the banner of New Democracy, a four-class alliance of workers, peasants, the petty bourgeoisie, and the national bourgeoisie, uniting all that could be united despite the different class interests in a common aim of saving the nation. In doing this, Mao had to stand up against the line and strategy of the existing CPC leadership, which was continuing to adhere to Comintern priorities of a worker-peasant alliance and the struggle for land. The essays then were directed against a mechanical adherence to Marxism-Leninism, against what Mao called left dogmatists who did not understand that conditions differ in different situations, that is, who were oblivious to the concrete circumstances of the political process. Conducting discussion at a high level of abstraction, these works represent the concentrated essence of CPC experience since its foundation in 1921 to that date in 1937, setting out not so much the new strategy itself as the methods by which Mao, learning from past mistakes, arrived at this new understanding of China's revolutionary situation. So 1937 was really a turning point for the CPC, from a prolonged period of essentially groping in the dark to a period of greater clarity, with policies and strategy now under Mao's leadership guided by the application of Marxism. Here I will highlight two aspects, one concerning the analysis of China's agrarian society, its relations of production and the dominant mode of production, and the other deriving from this the analysis of classes in the countryside, which in turn provided firstly the basis for a strategy for peasant revolution, and secondly, which opened up analysis of the interconnections between the national and the agrarian movements from a class basis, which is what ultimately guided China's revolution to victory. Now, just to be clear, when I ask, was Mao a Marxist, I'm really talking about the theoreticians he gathered round him in an unofficial think tank. So one of the texts I shall look at is Jen Badar's Theory of Rent. Now, Jen Badar was a leading Marxist theoretician and a party activist who played a major role in developing the idea of new democracy and who edited the first volumes of Mao's work. The other text I'm going to look at is just a few pages long. That's the work on how to analyse classes in the rural areas. So before delving into these, it's necessary for me to show their importance in addressing the particular challenges of understanding China's concrete conditions by going back to the beginning to set out the background. So the Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921 as an urban-based party. The revolutionary situation in the cities was escalating fast, and as opposition mounted against the imperialists and warlords, the nationalist Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party formed a united front in which the CPC was very much the junior partner. From Marx, Lenin and Stalin, the CPC drew the concepts of a bourgeois democratic revolution, of socialism, of class analysis, and the issues of bourgeois and proletarian leadership. The revolution was understood to comprise two processes, the national and the agrarian revolutions. And whilst it was recognised that the landlords and gentry at the local levels in the countryside served as the base of political power, at first the CPC had low expectations of the revolutionary contribution of the peasants, who were seen to be too scattered and difficult to organise. But in 1926, as the Kuomintang nationalist armies embarked on their northern expedition to wipe out the warlords and imperialists, support came not only from mass strikes by the workers in the cities, but also from the countryside with the rapid spread of peasant associations. Mao was to witness the peasants of Hunan rising like a tornado, seeing them parade the local bad gentry in the streets with paper hats, learning how they broke into the houses of the wealthy families to eat up all their food. He recognized in them a force capable of challenging the political power of the landlord class, even as their economic demands, that is the demands of the peasants, were still reformist for rent reductions rather than revolutionary land takeover. In this, Mao began to realize that of the two parts of the revolutionary process, the agrarian revolution was in fact the main content and the peasants the motive force. However, in 1927, at the point of victory against the warlords, the Kuomintang leader Chiang Kai-shek turned against the Communist Party and decimated the workers' movements. To escape the White Terror, the communists were forced to retreat to the southern mountains. So what had gone wrong? For Mao, already starting to think for himself, the failure of 1927 highlighted the importance of organizing a Red Army. However, his influence was very limited, and the main controversy was between Stalin and Trotsky. Stalin drew the conclusion, based on the Russian experience, that this was the moment that the national bourgeoisie had betrayed the revolution, and that the bourgeois democratic revolution could only be continued under a worker-peasant alliance with proletarian leadership. For Trotsky, the failure proved Stalin's idea of the United Front had been fundamentally misconceived. The capitalists were not a part of the revolution, but the enemy, and the only way forward was to build for socialism. However, the fact was the working class in China was really very small, and the CPC had been unable to establish a single working class base in a single city. There was no other choice than to rely on the peasants. But how to organize the peasants? What was their revolutionary nature given the conditions of China's political economy? What was the stage of China's revolution, and how was a worker-peasant alliance to be built? What role could there be for a proletarian party without a working class base? These were extremely challenging questions. In the first place, China's agrarian society defied easy.
What's happening?
Sorry, for some reason I was muted then. So China's agrarian society defied easy analysis. There were landlords of varying sizes, but no large-scale manorial estates farmed by serfs. There were tenants and owner cultivators, part tenants and part owner peasants. There were a great number of part-time laborers, and commercial relations were widespread, but there were no clear-cut classes of agricultural proletariat or rural bourgeoisie. Instead of promoting peasant independence and stimulating production, commercial relations only increased peasant impoverishment, with households sliding into debt and losing land. In other words, commercialization only strengthened the position of the landlords. So, was China feudal? Was it capitalist? How to make sense of this complex pattern of exploitation, of wage labor, usury, rent? What accounted for peasant impoverishment? Was it an inbuilt inability in the traditional peasant economy to respond to change and modernity? Was it the subsumption of agriculture by international capital, draining off the surplus? Clearly, analysis of agrarian society was key to understanding the peasant revolution. Who were to be the targets of land confiscation and who were to be the beneficiaries of land distribution? The revolutionary nature of the Chinese peasants and the roles of the rich, middle and poor peasants, where they stood in relation to the revolution, was a source of much contention in the early years of the Chinese Communist Party over policies regarding land. The Sixth Congress of the Chinese Communist Party in February 1928, with Stalin's guidance, confirmed the bourgeois democratic stage of the Chinese Revolution. However, many questions remained unresolved. The Congress, in fact, passed two apparently contradictory revolutions on land and on the peasants. One, which, following Leninist orthodoxy, stated that the rich peasants were allies in the democratic revolution against the landlords. The other, arguing explicitly that in contrast with the European struggle by petty proprietors utilizing land for a profit against the entrenched landed system, China's struggle was that of completely impoverished and landless peasants, as well as those self-cultivating farmers who had little land, against a feudal land monopoly. So here I come to the substance of my argument. And I will start by drawing attention to Chen Baoda's theory of rent. Chen Baoda was to argue that the main constraint on China's economic development was a system of parasitic landlordism based on monopoly rent. This arose in conditions of the concentration of land ownership in the hands of a small percentage of the population on the one hand, and its fragmented use on the other by the vast majority of land-hungry peasants who farmed on tiny plots. The feudal character of the system, he argued, was expressed in the extra economic nature of rent, which not only siphoned off surplus labour, but also cut into the necessary labour, the subsistence of the peasants. Now, Trotsky had argued that the impact of foreign capital and the development of commerce had brought about a fundamental change in the landowning classes, with a convergence of landlords, merchants, and officials linked with the city bourgeoisie and increasingly integrated with world capitalist system. However, Chen's argument was that despite the spread of commercial relations and of wage labour, there was no change in the form of surplus labour into capital. Wealth accumulated through rent was used not for capital investment, but for land speculation, to buy more land so as to collect more rent. As the agrarian economy stagnated, the peasants had no way out other than to cling to small parcels for cultivation in order to survive, their composition driving rents up ever higher. So unlike capitalist rent, Chen argued, the rate of rent was highest in the poorest areas where peasant demand was the greatest. The feudal nature of the system was for Chen also expressed in the fact that the predominant form of rent was paid in kind. Collected in grain, rent was used to speculate in rural markets, buying cheap and selling dear, all at the expense of the peasants. In other words, through their land monopoly, landlords were also able to dominate markets and control credit. So that unlike Europe, merchants and usurers grew on the basis of landlordism in China, not in opposition to it, with commercial capital and credit closely linked to monopoly rent. So it was not then, as Trotsky thought, that the landlords had changed, converging with merchants and usurers, but the reverse, as those making money from trade and credit used this to speculate in land and in grain. Chen's analysis then helped to clarify the revolutionary nature of the Chinese peasantry as distinct from the patterns in Europe. With cultivation for land for a profit constrained, it was the poor peasants with underutilized labour and land insufficient to their needs, together with the middle peasants, the majority of whom were burdened by debt. These together made up the main force of opposition to the feudal land monopoly. So this is the first example that I'm putting before you of the application of Marxism to the particular conditions of feudalism and capitalism in China. And this leads us now to the question of the analysis of rural classes in the countryside. So following the Sixth Party Congress, as I said, in 1928, the CPC at first took the line that rich peasants were allies in the democratic revolution against feudalism, and so were to be exempted from land confiscation and included in the peasant associations. However, as land reform proceeded very slowly, this so-called rich peasant line was identified as the obstacle. And the CPC leadership subsequently changed tack to pursue an anti-rich peasant line. Now, Trotsky had argued that the struggle against the rich peasants should be the first and not the second step in the revolution, in line with its socialist nature. The usurious wealthy peasant, he claimed, was generally the hated exploiter in the village, the agent of banking capital. But this was not the view taken by the CPC leadership, who were known as the 28 Bolsheviks. Instead, they adhered to the Comintern view that the national bourgeoisie had betrayed the democratic revolution and so saw the rich peasants as following them. They then took the view that bourgeois influence of the rich peasants had to be countered by the assertion of proletarian leadership. To Bolshevize the movement, it was necessary to mobilize the poor peasants and agricultural workers in poor peasant leagues in order to intensify the struggle against the village rich and contain the vacillation of the middle peasants, prioritizing the needs of the poor above all. Now, Mao, whilst he had been following the CPC leadership, had been drawing his own conclusions. He tried to apply the anti-rich peasant line, but he was to observe that these methods led to indiscriminate attacks on anyone seen to be better off, driving wealthy families into an impasse and inhibiting the middle peasants so that the poor peasants were left isolated. Disunity in the peasant movement, the contradictions among the peasants, left the villages susceptible to landlord intrigue as they sought to stage a comeback. The only way the landlords could be brought under control, Mao concluded, was if the poor tenant and owner peasants together were united. The turning point for Mao was the application of Marxism in how to analyse the classes in the rural areas, because by this Marxist method, rather than targeting wealth in general, whether the landlords, the rich peasants, or even well-to-do middle peasants, it became possible to distinguish different forms of wealth from feudal exploitation, from capitalist exploitation, and from own labour, and so to organise appropriately. The targets then were those who chiefly relied on collecting rent, the landlords. Whilst the rich peasants also rented out land, this was to a lesser extent, and they differed in that they engaged in manual labour, that is, they were farmers. Nevertheless, they obtained most of their wealth from exploitation, but this was mainly in the form of hiring labour. The middle peasants, on the other hand, relied mainly on their own labour, although they may have been involved in exploiting others or be exploited by others, but only to a lesser degree. The main difference between the middle peasants and the poor peasants was that whilst the former generally had sufficient to live on and did not have to hire out their labour, the latter, as part landowners, or completely dispossessed, had to rent out land but make up their insufficiency by hiring their labour out part-time. So whilst the poor peasants generally made up some 60 to 70% of the rural population, and the middle peasants 20 to 30%, the landlords and the rich peasants, who held most of the land, consisted only of 10% or so of the population. So this class analysis then provided the basis for a strategy for organising the peasants' democratic movement, targeting feudal relations, that is, rented land only, and prioritising not the needs of the poor, but unity with the middle peasants. Some of these had become targets of the poor peasant leagues, since they also engaged in hiring labour, although this was only to a lesser extent, since they relied mainly on their own labour. Taking the middle peasants as the centre of the struggle, Mao's new strategy, whilst mobilising the poor, as the most active peasants, sought to draw the more independent owner cultivators into the peasant associations. His strategy also cut a completely different line on the rich peasants, treating them neither as allies nor the enemy nor in the enemy camp, but seeking to neutralize them. Class analysis revealed their dual characteristics, part capitalist as well as part feudal. Mao then, on the one hand, opposed political leniency towards the rich peasants, excluding them from the peasants' organizations, since they tended to take the landlord's side in opposing land confiscation, but on the other hand, advocated economic leniency, encouraging them to develop their farm business, dividing them from the landlords by fostering their capitalist tendencies. And it was for this stand on the middle peasants, as well as a certain leniency towards the rich peasants, that Mao was accused of departing from a class viewpoint. For his part, he cast his critics as left dogmatists. And this now takes us to the third aspect I wish to highlight concerning the interconnection between the national and the agrarian revolutions, which could only be understood by means of class analysis. So Mao's reassessment of the rich peasants opened the door to a reconsideration of the national bourgeoisie's betrayal of the revolution in 1927. Rather than having thrown in their lot with the pro-imperialist, pro-feudal camp, as Stalin had thought, Mao came to the view that the urban capitalists, in fact, were vacillating or wavering. As the Japanese began to gather their advance into China, Mao saw that these nationalists were ready to join forces again with the CPC to form a new united front of resistance. Making his stand against the left dogmatists, he succeeded in radically shifting policy from the two-class worker-peasant alliance to a four-class bloc, the new democracy involving the national bourgeoisie. The main contradiction Mao understood was now between the nation and imperialist aggression, and in the interests of uniting all who could be united into the largest force possible to defend the nation, peasant revolution was to take second place. Land policy was to be moderated from land confiscation to rent and interest rate reduction. So this was, of course, a compromise for the peasants, but at least they saw some benefit from the easing of the rent burden. Meanwhile, the landlords and rich peasants, encouraged to concentrate on their business interests, even started to sell off some of their land. However, these bourgeois reforms during the anti-Japanese resistance period were to lead to problems later. With the defeat of the Japanese in 1945, the United Front with the Kuomintang collapsed, and as the situation reverted to civil war, the CPC returned to the policy of land takeover, aiming at the complete eradication of feudal relations. Now, what happened as land policy shifted from moderate to radical, at least in some villages, is recounted in detail in the books of William Hinton, Fan Shen, and David and Isabel Crooks on 10 Mile Inn. These describe how local cadres and villagers confronted the problem of not so thorough land reform. Numbers of poor peasants still had insufficient land. The blame was laid on the landlords, alien class elements who had infiltrated the movement, as well as on cadre corruption. Once again, the situation in the villages descended into chaos. Poor peasants even went to the landlords' houses mob-handed to dig up non-existent buried treasure. The village leaders were summarily kicked out of the party for collusion with the village rich. Mao ordered the reissuing of How to Analyse Classes in the Rural Areas to expose the error of indiscriminate attacks on all forms of wealth. However, it also became clear that this poor peasant line had actually been a reaction against a middle peasant line when, during the anti-Japanese resistance, the landlords had sold land to the benefit of the better off peasants who could afford to buy. This bourgeois transfer of land through purchase rather than through revolutionary confiscation by peasant mobilization had resulted in only a partial land distribution, increasing inequality of land holdings among the peasants. The problem of not so thorough land reform then was a matter of contradictions among the peasants rather than simply of landlord opposition and cadre corruption. Subsequently, as Hinton and the Crooks show, problems were solved through a process which involved both party and the villagers in study meetings to apply the text analysing the classes in order to understand the structure and the potential of their village economy. At the same time, in areas newly liberated as the CPC now swept across the country, the land confiscation strategy was refined, narrowing the targets from the bigger landowners step by step down to the village rich, as the peasant movement itself was built up in stages driven by poor peasant activism, but drawing in the middle peasants to take a proportion of leadership positions in the new village associations. This association, seen from a Marxist perspective, then revealed how different class lines of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat impacted on peasant organisation, the one relying on peasant passivism, exacerbating contradictions amongst the peasants, the other guiding peasant mobilisation through stages, handling the contradictions that arose amongst them in the process of rural transformation. In the end, the CPC was able to gain overall leadership as it finally ousted the Kuomintang and their US backers to end the imperialist domination of China altogether. Now, winning the support of the national bourgeoisie was made possible by the CPC's demonstration of leadership over the peasant movement. As the poor peasants gained sufficient land for survival, a rich peasant economy was also allowed to prosper. In this way, the party proved its ability to establish stability in the countryside necessary to set China on the path of economic growth and development and creating hope for the future. Marxism had enabled Mao to situate China's historical trajectory within the general trend of the world from feudalism to capitalism to socialism. The CPC saw their revolution advancing within the wider world socialist trend. The Bolshevik Revolution and Soviet support had given much confidence, and China's democratic revolution even contained seeds of a socialist transition, not only in the mobilization of the poor, but in addition, as village economies were transformed through land reform, some socialist features were nurtured, notably local government control of village granaries and the fostering of mutual aid exchanges of labour for tools and draft animals, which knitted the poor and the middle peasants together. There was, as the CPC painfully learnt, no blueprint for revolution. Nevertheless, the conceptual tools of Marxist theory gave the CPC the means to understand the specificity of China's historical conditions, the distinctive combination of feudalism with commercial relations, which gave the movement of impoverished peasants quite a different character from the anti-feudal movements in Europe, defining distinctive roles for the different sections of the peasants. The failure to understand the differences in the Chinese and European revolutions continued to confuse many in the Western left. The charge that Mao was unproletarian still echoes in critiques of Chinese socialism today. But the CPC's proletarian leadership under Mao was not to be counted in the number of workers in the party, which was after all very small in the country as a whole. Nor was it about uniting the peasant struggles with those of the working class in the towns. Adventurous attempts to take over cities after 1927 had failed. The Chinese Revolution, Mao had realized, rather than consisting of a single national event simultaneously sweeping across cities and countryside at one particular moment, was to be a protracted struggle already taking place after 1927 in the armed struggle of the peasants against the landlords. The CPC certainly developed deep roots amongst the peasants, but proletarian leadership was really a matter of the application of Marxism to find solutions to China's problems. Mao was a Marxist in action, using Marxist methodology to unravel the complexities of agrarian society, using analysis of production relations as a means of identifying classes so as to provide the basis for a revolutionary strategy. From Marxist class analysis, the CPC was to develop a strategy of shared benefit so as to unite the various classes around mass peasant mobilization. Only in this way was it possible to create a force sufficient to defeat feudalism and imperialism and end the constraints on China's development. If I was asked what Mao brought to Marxism, what he added to Marxism, from which others should learn, I would say it was indeed the methods set out in his essays on philosophy. The theory of contradiction enabled the CPC to take a holistic approach, building up a picture of the whole, piecing together the parts, looking to the long-term trends whilst identifying the immediate primary and secondary contradictions. This then made it possible to prioritize and sequence so as to take a step at a time, organizing class alliances according to changes in objective circumstances, as the CPC did in focusing now on the class struggle in the countryside and now on the nation. By looking ahead, it became possible, in the midst of meeting the challenges of the present, to prepare the ground for the transition to the next stage. And the important point also is that Mao's approach laid weight not only to the central class struggle, but also the contradictions amongst the people, not only the problem of the landlords, but the contradictions within the peasant movement. Oh dear. I'm just drawing towards my conclusion now. Mao's strategy, whilst based on analysis of material conditions, had appreciated that class lines are sometimes not so clear-cut. The rich peasants were a bit feudal. The urban business families also retained some property in their home villages. For Mao, class struggle, whilst principles, was not about just about being for and against. There was room for neutrality. There was room for wavering in political class attitudes. Later, he spelt out in On the Correct Handling of Contradictions Amongst the People, issued in 1957, how it was possible for antagonistic class relations to be handled in non-antagonistic ways, just as the landlord-peasant relationship had been handled during the anti-Japanese resistance, and the relationship between capitalist and worker were handled under the new democracy. And above all, I'd emphasize Mao's approach of learning from past mistakes. As we reflect on the achievements of the past 100 years, we should not forget how new China, with its independence from imperialism, was built on the strength of the peasant movement. And something that sometimes gets lost in debates about whether China is state capitalist or socialist, that the state today remains a people's democracy based on the alliance of workers with the peasants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for that very informative lecture. It was a masterclass of Marxist analysis and political economy. We've now got time for questions and contributions. There's a question from George Gonzalez. It was put up very early in the talk. Do you want to put your question, George?
Yes, hello. My question was on the question of Marxism. Of course, at the core of Marxism, I would submit, is internationalism. And so what do you make of the Mao policy of socialism in one country?
Thank you for that question. The policy of socialism in one country, I don't think was Mao's policy in particular. I think it was a policy that he derived from Lenin, and it was based on a particular understanding of imperialism and the possibility of revolution taking place at the weakest point in the imperialist chain. And so I think that, Mao, as I was arguing, understood that there were two elements to China's revolution. One was the national revolution against imperialism, and the other one was the peasant revolution against the feudal relations and landlord domination in the countryside. And so it was China's national struggle against the Japanese imperialists and against the US imperialists, and the gaining of independence in 1949. That this was achieved on the basis of the mobilization of the peasants and their positive support for the Chinese Communist Party that enabled the People's Republic of China to move swiftly from 1949 to 1956 to the transition to socialism. And Mao understood that China could advance on a socialist basis because of the cooperation amongst the peasants, and that it was possible in China to put cooperation before mechanization, and therefore to continue along the socialist path. That's how I would endeavour to answer your question. I think that the internationalism actually was that that Mao understood that, you know, that this process of China's democratic revolution, which was an anti-feudal, not an anti-capitalist revolution, as I've tried to discuss, but that he understood that this was taking place within the worldwide trend towards socialism, which had been set in motion by the Bolshevik Revolution, of course, and that this meant that when the Chinese Communist Party returned to the United Front with the Kuomintang nationalists working for a four-bloc alliance with the national bourgeoisie, that because of the world socialist trend, it was possible for this four-bloc alliance to at least maintain the independence of the Chinese Communist Party, and later, in fact, to actually leadership over the national bourgeoisie.
Thank you, Jenny. Can I bring in Evan Pritchard?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Jenny if she could comment on the extent to which she feels that much of the criticism from other Marxists and from other communists of Mao in terms of defining him as deviating from Marxism or not having a fully developed Marxist approach was reflected in the growing divergence between the USSR and its allied socialist countries, and the People's Republic of China in the 60s, and particularly in the 70s, because obviously, as you say, you know, there was criticism from both sides of the, if you like, broadly the Trotskyist, Stalinist sort of divide. Actually, so often quite similar criticisms of Mao. Something I think that Edgar Snow actually refers to as well in Red Star Over China in the early period. But I get the impression. I just if you could comment on the extent that these kind of ideas about Mao were, you know, came out again in more force during that period, as I say, during the period when there was that schism between Beijing and Moscow.
Oh, thanks very much for that question, Evan. It's a really interesting question. And I can't say that I've actually looked into that particular aspect of the Sino-Soviet split, which was perhaps more to do with the international situation and the criticisms that Mao had of the application of Soviet-style planning in China, which was a far more peasant-based country at the time. I think that the point that I was certainly trying to bring out, on the one hand, I did make quite a lot of reference to Trotsky's analysis of China. Now, I don't mean to exaggerate the influence of Trotsky on the Chinese Revolution, because it was quite minimal. That nevertheless, my feeling is that many people, it is a point that continues to confuse people on the Western left, and there is this kind of rather superficial view that somehow or other China missed out on organizing for a socialist revolution in the 1920s, which was a completely unrealistic strategy, because the working class population of China was scarcely 1 or 2% of the entire population, and the Communist Party was simply not strong enough to hold on to any cities. So I think that there was also more so the differences between the line of the Comintern, which was that the national bourgeoisie had betrayed the revolution, and the 28 Bolsheviks, more to the point, the 28 Bolsheviks who adhered to the Stalinist view and then didn't recognize, as Mao did, the possibility that the urban capitalists would be prepared to join again with the Communist Party to fight against the Japanese. And so we had this situation where Mao was really rethinking the whole question about the revolutionary role of the peasants, where the rich peasants stood, recognizing that they weren't the rich peasants of European struggles or even the rich peasants of the Soviet Union, but they had these part feudal and part capitalist roots. And so he was really rethinking the whole question about feudalism and capitalism, which allowed him to open his mind to the new possibilities and recognize the shifts in class attitudes and class behaviors. And as I said, it's for that he was considered to be unproletarian. And I think it's very important, to kind of reflect on this kind of workerist attitude to proletarian leadership, that somehow proletarian leadership has to be, with proletarian leadership, you need to have, workers outnumbering everybody else. I mean, that just didn't work in China. And indeed, it led to some very serious mistakes. And the proletarian leadership is really about the application of Marxism. The application of Marxism, of course, Marxism can only be applied when a communist party has got effective roots amongst the people. But really, I think that, and the same thing applies today. I think that, we have to understand how, in its 100-year history, that the Communist Party has consistently sought to apply Marxism to China's concrete situation and the actual challenges that it faces in reality.
Could I now bring in Nigel Green?
Yeah.
We can't hear you, Nigel. Nigel, we can't hear you. I'll now bring in Michael Wong-Sam, please.
Hey, Mike Wong-Sam's at this. He's just about to speak. Oh.
I want to say that I completely agree with what Jenny was saying about the assessment that Mao was a Marxist and was applying the principles of Marxism to the the question behind the particular circumstance of China. Of course, I would say that, I mean, on the dogmatic question of whether there was proletarian leadership, of course, that wouldn't have even applied in the Soviet Union, because the proletariat, the industrial proletariat, is such as a tiny minority of the country in the on the eve of the Russian Revolution. And the reason that we can say that the Bolsheviks did comprise a proletariat, they can correctly identify the way in which the class formation in the Soviet Union directly led to the necessity for realizing, beginning to realize some of the socialist tasks which are inherent in this situation. And I think that the situation, therefore, as Jenny outlined it in China, is that there were, there were feudal relations mixed in with capitalist relations in the urban centres, and so therefore, similar to the way that it applied in the Soviet Union, that there would be a combined character to the revolution in China, and this being the case, therefore, it's necessary, given the fact that the proletariat is a tiny proportion of the population, it's necessary for there to be a bloc, a coalition of classes and social forces. And you have to do, and the great merits of Mao, therefore, his contribution, if you like, to Marxism, his major contribution, apart from the essay on contradiction, which I think is a work of genius. And I think that the question of identifying that you have to discern what is the difference between the contradiction between the people and the enemy, and contradictions within the people. And you have to therefore, first of all, decide who is in the people and who comprises the enemy. And that, of course, what Jenny outlined is that changes at different points in time. So at the start of the struggle, especially when the communists were being persecuted by the Kuomintang, there is a different alignment of those questions in comparison to the situation where there was an invasion from Japan, an imperialist invasion, an occupation of the country by the Japanese Empire. So Marx actually had a concrete analysis as opposed to the analysis which was being put forward by what I think he correctly says are dogmatists, both in the camp of Stalinism and in the camp of Trotskyism. They had a dogmatic approach, and Mao was proved right, because actually the Chinese Revolution triumphed under Mao's leadership and departure from both the communists and from the Trotskyist leadership. So I think that Mao has been proven correct and has made a very meaningful contribution to Marxism.
Do you want to respond to that, Jenny, or should we note it and take more questions?
I think we notice. I mean, that's what I was trying to convey, and I think that that there is much to be learnt from the Chinese Communist method of looking to the long term and analysing the contradictions that enables you to do so, which is primary, which is secondary, how you move from one stage to another stage, how you sequence, how you prioritize. It's this kind of strategic thinking, which I think is really the most important carryover from China to communists elsewhere in the world.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Michael. We'll try Nigel again.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me now, Kevin?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, good. Thanks about that. So sorry about that, guys. Entirely my fault. My question. Hi, Jenny. My question is slightly different. Would you know, Jenny, when Mao was a young man, I think he worked in the library at Peking University. I think he was a library assistant. That was his job. Would you know what sort of Marxist texts, classical Marxist texts, would be available in Mandarin at that time. I mean, I don't know. I just wonder if you would know, when Mao was a young man, what sort of the writings of Marx and Engels, never mind Lenin, but Marx and Engels would Mao have had access to. And my second comment is that I don't know if you're familiar with this, Jenny, but in the book Molotov Remembers, which is a series of interviews given by Molotov to a Soviet writer, I think in the 1970s. It's an interview. It's about all sorts of things, but Molotov comments about meeting Mao, presumably when Mao visited Moscow, I think probably in about 1950 or something like that. And Molotov says that, or apparently said that he, meaning Mao, he was far from a Marxist, of course. He confessed to me that he had never read Capital. This is it on Molotov Remembers. If you know familiar with the edition, it's on page 81. So anyway, I'll stop there, Jenny. I just wonder if you'd want to comment on those 2 points.
Well, thank you for your questions, Nigel. It's quite technical. I think that the Communist Party in China started out of a Marxist study group at Beijing University. And of course, the success of the Bolsheviks had a tremendous impact in China. And so they would have been reading Marxist texts. I'm absolutely certain that the Chinese Communist Party had theoreticians who read Capital. I don't know Mao. I didn't have an opportunity to speak to him, and I didn't have the opportunity to ask him whether he'd read Capital. But I mean, it's absolutely clear from Jem Bodar theory on monopoly rent that he's very familiar with Volume 3 of Capital. So, yeah. Perhaps there are some questions in the chat now, Kevin.
There's quite a few coming in. I just was going to ask you myself about the influence of the work-study movement and the large numbers of young Chinese revolutionary students who went to study in France and work in factories. They would have had a very significant ideological influence on the Chinese party in the early days.
Yes, that's I noticed the article in the Morning Star today about that. I'm very, very pleased to see that people are looking at that work study movement, because of course this was something that Zhou Enlai benefited from. It's something that Deng Xiaoping benefited from. I don't think that you can understand Marxism unless you see in industrial capitalism. And of course, there was industrial capitalism. There were the factories that were being invested in by the foreign powers in China. And it's out of that you understand, exploitation, the exploitation of wage labor, the accumulation of capital, investment, and all of these things that really didn't exist in the traditional Chinese setup. The work-study movement was a very interesting development because the Chinese government had negotiated with the British and the other powers to send a workforce of Chinese laborers to assist Britain in World War I, because they were running out of labor, because they were recruiting everybody they could into the army. They needed laborers to dig the trenches and unload the munitions and all of this kind of thing, something that has been rarely acknowledged in European history, the contribution that the Chinese made. And the Chinese government actually negotiated as part of that a work-study program so that Chinese could go and study and get experience of industrial organization in France. And that would have also that would also have been an opportunity for them to be introduced to the ideas of Marx and Lenin.
Yes. Next question from Hong Jiang.
Oh yes, thanks. Thanks for this lecture. I have a very brief question. Karl Marx has proposed the Asiatic mode of production or Asiatic society to illustrate China, India, and other Asian countries. But this concept is relatively marginal to orthodoxical Marxism. Some scholars even think it's a wrong idea. How do you understand the relation between this concept and the Maoism of the Chinese situation? Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much, Hong Jiang. That's not just a little question. It's quite a big question, really. I mean, this opens up a different kind of angle on the Chinese revolution. In my view, you know, that the mode of production in China was predominantly feudal, but nevertheless, China clearly had these Asiatic, what I call Asiatic features of a centralized state and these close-knit village communities.
You see it?
Society. I would argue that after the Ming-Qing transition, when there was a bit widespread of commercial relations, commercial shopping in China, the landlord's position was quite weakened. However, the landlords were able, by using their privileged contacts as officials or with officials in the bureaucratic state, and also their influence in the clans or lineage, which were hierarchical social structures, that they were considered to be influential, generally educated, and that they actually used those their influential position in order to rebuild or refeudalize Chinese society as the later Qing dynasty developed. So I do think that the question of the Asiatic mode of production, I don't accept that that China was an Asiatic mode of production, at least not at that time, but that nevertheless these Asiatic features are very, very important in China's social and political structure.
Thank you, Jenny. Next question, Nathan Morrison.
Hello. Yeah, so what do you think about the power struggles that happened during the Jiangxi period between Mao and his followers against the 28 Bolsheviks, in terms of that as being a potential root of the Sino-Soviet split?
I think Evan put that question before, so thank you, but I don't think I've got anything to add to that. So,
okay, Nolene Grattan.
Oh, hi. I just wondered if Mao would have any advice for the left of the Labour Party about how they might proceed towards anything better than what we seem to have facing us now with the Tory majority.
Oh, thank you very much, Nolene, but you're asking me to solve the problems of Britain. I can't do that.
Mao, I'm asking you what you think Mao might
but that is one of the reasons why I'm getting out there with the message, because I'm showing the methodology. You know, there is no blueprint. You have to apply Marxism to the concrete challenges.
situation.
I said
Yeah.
all of there's the importance of deciding what is the main contradiction, what is the secondary contradiction,
Mm,
what is it that we have to focus on now? How do we
yeah.
prepare the ground for how we get to the next stage? Break things down in small steps. And this is
Yeah.
still what the Chinese Communist Party is doing today. You know, that after 1989, with the reform and opening up, they said, we've got to develop the forces of production. The main contradiction is between the lack of development of production and the needs of the people, and the wants and needs of the people. And now they've changed that a bit because China has developed, and now they're looking more at the contradiction involving things like, you know, environmental pollution and things to do with quality of life. And so they're just, you know, taking things a step at a time. And sometimes people just think, oh, let's just abolish capitalism. Why don't the Chinese just abolish capitalism? You know, it's really sobering as we take stock of the situation 100 years on, that the Chinese Communist Party started out from the very foundation to ease the burdens of the Chinese people, to improve the livelihood of the Chinese people, to take back control over China's destiny, you know, to gain the independence of the nation. And it's taken 100 years for them to eradicate extreme poverty. We have to have a long-term mindset. We have to adjust ourselves. You know, in Britain, we're thinking always about the next election, the next election, the next election, and we're not looking. We have to think that this can be a long-term venture, and how do we create the conditions now in which we can step forward, you know, take the next steps forwards. So I'm sorry, Nolene, that's the best that I can do, but that is my message, is that, you know, the lessons are there from as Mao set out. What are the main contradictions? What are the secondary contradictions? How do you handle the main contradiction? How do you handle the contradiction between the people and the enemy? How do you handle the contradictions among the people? And don't forget, people can change their minds. What makes people swing from one to the other? You know, and you know, and what about neutralizing some people if we can't get rid of everybody in one go? So there you go.
Thank you for that.
And Kolya Abramsky makes a point on the same theme. Kolya?
I didn't have a question. It's just a comment that basically that approach is by highlighting the question of different contradictions, it paves the way for thinking about stages of struggle. And so one moment lays the ground for the next moment, and so fulfilling necessary preconditions. So I think it's very important for thinking in terms of different stages, both short, medium, and longer term. No question particularly.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question. There's a couple more from Rafael Garcia Diaz. Are you going to come in, please? Rafael? I'll read the question, Jenny. I think it's a bit of a moot point. Does the lack of control of their own territories, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibet, tell us something about China's capabilities to expand socialism beyond its frontiers?
Right. Well, I suppose I'm not convinced that you know, China is interested in expanding socialism beyond its frontiers. So I'm not sure quite about how to respond to that. I mean, obviously, you know, that on Hong Kong and Taiwan, I mean, when the Kuomintang lost the Civil War in 1949, it left and set up the Republic of China in Taiwan, and the Republic of China, with US support and with the support of the West, was recognized as the political authority over the whole of China. And representatives in Taiwan used to stand up in the assembly or the parliament and say, I am the representative of Guangdong, and I am the representative of Sichuan, and that kind of thing. And that was only ended when the African nations, having gained freedom from colonialism and a seat at the United Nations, voted to recognize the Chinese Communist Party as the legitimate leader of China. As far as Hong Kong was concerned, I think the Chinese Communist Party made the decision that Hong Kong could usefully serve as a window to the West, which it did for many, many decades. And the British government was prepared to recognize the government of China, and China let the British carry on running the Hong Kong colony until there was the opportunity to, with the end of the treaties, the expiring of the treaties, for Hong Kong to be handed back to China. I don't think that China is looking for war or disruption in any of these places. It would rather resolve these kinds of contradictions amongst the people, as it were, by, or if they're antagonistic, at least resolve them by non-antagonistic means.
Yes. Thank you. Could I call Riyad Akbar?
Oh, thanks very much, Kevin. Fantastic talk, Jenny. I just wanted to ask, in the context of applying Marx's principles to the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, to Mao's policies, can you talk a little bit about how Marx's principles inform those approaches, if you think they did?
Yeah. Again, that's an interesting question, which is stretching me beyond the focus on the peasant revolution. I would say that I mean, it's quite interesting to see, you know, what view the Chinese Communist Party was to end up taking on the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. When Deng Xiaoping took the leadership position in 1989, because the criticism was cast in terms of contradictions. And the criticism was that Mao hadn't adapted the contradictions of the class struggle to the new conditions of China as a socialist country, and that he pursued class struggle as the main contradiction, whereas Deng Xiaoping took class struggle as a secondary contradiction. And Deng Xiaoping argued that the main contradiction, as I said before, was that between the backward forces of production and the advanced and the demands and needs of the Chinese people, and that for the sake of stability, class struggle should be put on the back burner, not forgotten about, not denied, as the Chinese saw the Soviet Union had essentially done, but nevertheless to a secondary position. So in actual fact, the Chinese Communist Party came to the conclusion that Mao had really departed from his own principles in promoting the struggle against the bourgeoisie inside the party, and in promoting the proletarian dictatorship in advance of the objective conditions that China was actually in. And I think that's that's a fair summary. I think that there was actually I would agree with the article by Carlos Martinez in the Morning Star recently, that we shouldn't judge the whole Mao period by the disasters of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, and which have been greatly exaggerated, although indeed they incurred terrible losses. It's just that, you know, that there is no blueprint, and that the methods that are used in one concrete set of circumstances don't necessarily apply in another concrete set of circumstances. And I think that was what the Chinese communists were struggling with at that time. That really opens up a new subject. So I don't really want to go on about that any further, but I hope that goes some way towards providing a way of looking at that question.
Thank you, Jenny. I think we've picked up all questions and there's no hands indicating. So I think I can now move to close the meeting. But before I do, on behalf of the Marx Memorial Library and all of us present, can I thank you, Jenny, for delivering a stimulating lecture and very comprehensive answers to the questions. And also can I thank those contributors who asked questions and those who've put information and resources into the chat. That's much appreciated. Jenny will be speaking at Saturday's Morning Star and Friends of Socialist China online meeting, 100 Years on the Path to Socialism. It starts at 11 AM and there's a link in the chat. Also, as is customary at these events, can I call on anyone at this meeting who is not a member of the Marx Memorial Library to join? Details are on the website. It's £25 and a concession rate of £15. And members receive a copy of the library journal, Theory and Struggle, the latest edition of which, on the theme, Marxism in a post-pandemic time of struggle, will be launched at a library event this time next week, 7 PM. And speakers include Professor Mary Davis, Michael Roberts and Vijay Prashad. So thanks everybody for attending and take care. Cheers.